Hey, everybody. Oh my God, I got a sister that's gonna talk to us today. Ooh, man, Strong Inspirations is coming on strong. I'm telling you, it's straight, no chaser. We give it to you. I don't give it to you. I let the people who know, and you know what? I get them, some of them people, they got Ph.D s. They went to college a long time. They studied their craft. They know what they write books on it. Matter of fact, the lady on the day wrote a book about what she gonna talk about. Ph.D. in the house. Because I want to make sure it's right. And I want you people talk about, I don't know, I hear all these same old stories by the book. No, you don't hear the same old stories on Strong Inspirations. No, you don't. You hear stuff that I never heard. And today is one of them, but we know the perspective. So if you got 30 seconds, take your cursor and hit the subscribe button to the channel. Hit the like button on one of these videos. Hit the notifications bell so you get a bing when another video come up. And I put, oh man, every now and then I put 2-3 videos up a week, and then tell somebody. You know who I am? I got this movie out. It's called Business in the Black, The Rise of Black Business in America. Slaves that went to college, slaves who owned businesses, interviews with people whose family owned a business in the 1900s. I've been to 40 cities showing this movie on my own dime. And it's on Amazon. If you don't have a DVD player, get on Amazon. And then, you know, to compliment that, I wrote this book. The book got 200 facts, amazing stuff. And I don't even add no commentary because I'm not a PhD type person. So I just used the facts and I kind of rewrote them so I wasn't plagiarizing nobody. It's on Amazon and my website, Inspirations by Strong. So, all right, let's get started with this sister that is ready to tell you something that she knows what she's talking about. Introduce yourself. Thank you so very much for being on Strong Inspirations.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm Cherisse Jones-Branch, PhD, and I am the James and Wanda Lee Vaughn Endowed Professor of History and Dean of the Graduate School at Arkansas State University. And I also have a book forthcoming called Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas between 1914 and 1965. And it's my third book on women, my second book on Black women in particular.
Wow, write a book. That's beautiful.
Mhm.
One of the things that you and I talked about is you grew up in Charleston, South Carolina.
Born and raised.
I mean, so you're around that history every day. You walk past it. What is that like
Well,
to see it?
I grew up and was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, and I grew up in a place that was filled with history. But what I didn't learn and what I had to teach myself was the history of the Black people in that area, because that's not what we were really taught when I was growing up, which is interesting, right? When you consider that the population, the Black population in that area is at least 30%.
Sure.
We knew, for example, that Black people were enslaved, but they didn't talk about the other things like Black business ownership, Black political activism. And they certainly didn't talk about the roles of Black women. So we didn't learn about any of that stuff in school. But fortunately, there's been a lot of scholarship that's been done since then that talks about all of that. And that's one of the things that I talk about in my first book. The title is Crossing the Line, and it's interracial activism in South Carolina during and after World War I. And there have been a couple of books since that have talked about that. But when I was in high school back in the 80s, nobody was talking about that kind of stuff. And many people who've spent their entire lives in Charleston aren't aware of how rich and deep and robust Black history is in that part of the world.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing. But I mean, you had to walk past the port where the slave ship docked.
Mhm, mhm.
I mean, and is that a tourist attraction and that kind of thing too?
Well, increasingly, the history of the enslaved has become a hot commodity down in Charleston. So now there is a museum about enslaved Black people in downtown Charleston, their Gullah Geechee tours. They're even building, they're actively working on finishing the African American Museum down in Charleston, the International
Sure.
African American Museum. So these have been developments within the past, I don't know, 15 to 20 years.
Okay.
But like I said, when I was growing up, I remember walking in parts of downtown Charleston that were predominantly white, not knowing that at one point in history, that area was all Black. So
Wow.
nobody talked about that kind of history. I know about it now. I
Yeah.
read it, I wrote about it, but nobody was actively teaching young people that kind of history back then.
Is it a kind of thing among white people or others that they try to keep it hush hush because they're embarrassed? Are white people embarrassed to know what they did when they live in those
I, I
areas?
I think it's a combination of things. Perhaps it's that, but then it's also the fact that for far too long, and this is still the case, the history of marginalized peoples didn't matter. And so, in order to keep up the myth that these people are inferior, you have to hide their history, you have to hide their accomplishments. So, I don't know how people feel about it when these things are revealed. I do know that from my own teaching experience, that Black students are absolutely amazed, but white students are too. And they're often very angry, not at me, but they're angry that nobody taught them this history.
Wow.
They're angry too that they
Yeah.
have been denied
Oh,
that history.
yeah, sure. Because I remember I was in Montgomery and I was at a restaurant, and down 20 feet away was a fountain, a big, beautiful fountain in the middle of the right downtown on Dexter Avenue, to give you exactly the pinpoint. But that fountain used to be a slave auction site.
Right.
Now, there was a historical marker, but I wondered how would it make me feel if I walked past that to get to my office every day, knowing that that's what it was, and they were really kind of.
Well, I mean, I suppose it depends on how deeply you think about it. If you spend time pondering on what that actually meant, the separation of families, the humiliation of men and women, the traumatizing young children. If you sat and thought very deeply about the physical and psychological implications of what those people went through, maybe it will affect you. But if you
Yeah,
don't know that history, and if you are not prepped to think in those kinds of ways about marginalized people, it might very well not impact you at all.
sure, sure. Now, one of the things that you had said to me about what Black people felt like after slavery ended,
Mhm,
who and why they didn't leave the South.
mhm,
Am
mhm.
I correct on that?
That's
So
correct. That's
it
correct.
just seemed to me, I mean, my family left. They were out of North Carolina,
Mhm,
and it was for jobs and whatnot. I don't know if further down the line, I must admit I didn't do the research if they were getting enslaved and getting beat, that kind of thing.
mhm.
But they heard of a better opportunity. So what was the thinking of those who did not want to leave?
Well, let me start by saying this: the migration experience is far more complicated than most people realize. Yes, people left, but people came back and forth all the time. And even among those African Americans who remained in the South, they had members of their family who left. So, like for example, in my own family, my mom and dad, who are in their mid to late 70s, chose to remain in the South, but other segments of the family, even their own siblings, moved to places like New York, right?
Right.
And they lived in New York for 40 or 50 years, and they've since returned to South Carolina if they didn't die in New York or Jersey or wherever they happen
Sure, sure.
happen to be. So that's a complicated story. But among those who chose to stay, I think we only focus on the story of their victimization, and we focus on the story of oppression. And yes, that's real. But to be honest, it's real in the North, in the Midwest too, right?
Sure.
Because I know stories about Detroit and New York and Jersey and all those places where there weren't necessarily laws that kept Black people from accessing certain kinds of opportunities or living in certain spaces. But I think we all know where you can and can't go in those places.
Sure.
But among those Black people who chose to stay in the South, there's a certain love of the land and a love-hate relationship with the South. It's where their ancestors were. It's where they were tied to the land. Some of these Black people owned land and had businesses and built institutions like schools and churches and things of that sort. And those were institutions that were very important to them because they're owned and operated by Black people. And they also want to make this place better. So some people leave because they can realize better opportunities somewhere else. Others choose to stay, or maybe they even left for a period of time, but chose to come back because this is where my roots are. This is where my home is. So it's no accident that many of these people who leave actually end up coming back to the South, or they visit quite frequently because there's just something about that connection to the land, to your history, to your roots, and to your family. So among my relatives who migrated out of South Carolina and went to New York and New Jersey, when I was growing up, they came back and forth to South Carolina all the time.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
All
sure.
the time.
Yeah,
They
sure.
would either come back because somebody died,
Sure.
or because the quality of food is better, or there were things that they could get in South Carolina that they couldn't get up
Sure.
in New York City. So they would
Sure.
come down and pack up all of that stuff. Or like when my grandmother was living, let's say she canned stuff. You
Yeah.
can't get that in New York,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
At least not at the time. So
Sure.
you pack up your car with all of that stuff and then you take it back to wherever.
Yeah,
So
sure.
it's not just bodies, it's not just people who move to those spaces, it's history, it's culture, it's foodways, all of that stuff, right? I mean, when you find things like soul food restaurants in Harlem, New York, they're eating the foods that I grew up eating in Charleston, South Carolina. Why?
Sure.
Because
Sure.
the restaurant was founded by a Black woman who was from the Low Country, South
Sure.
Carolina.
Sure.
She lived her entire life in New York,
Sure.
but she transported those foodways with her.
Is there a is there let me is there a different attitude for people who didn't leave? Do people who, when they leave, and the people who stay, do they kind of resent the people who left that didn't stay to fight the fight? Is that a question?
I I can't fully speak to that. I think just in the course of human reactions,
Yes.
that's entirely possible.
Yes.
Particularly if you pretend as if life is exponentially better
Yes.
in those spaces, because that's one of the things that I remember being, a young woman, a little girl down in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'd have cousins who came down from New York. I thought they were living the big life.
Right.
I thought, they were living in big mansions in Harlem, New York, in the Bronx,
Right.
Brooklyn, places. We didn't know. We didn't know. And so they thought we were country because we had low country,
Yes.
accents or whatever.
Yes.
We thought they were really living the high life. We didn't really know that a big
Yes.
part of the reason why they kept coming back down south was because we had a lot of things they didn't have.
Yes. I got you.
Mhm.
Did the white people, the white what okay, let me see what Jim Crow laws.
Mhm.
That didn't necessarily go up north, did it? And it was just an attitude and maybe some real laws legalized in the South. What's that?
Okay, so
And how black people felt that
Jim
way.
Crow laws. So let me start with this. Um, at least from the time of slavery through the 20th century, America in some ways has always been anti-Black, right? You may
Okay.
have had laws in the South that kept people segregated, but the attitude was nationwide. And just so we're clear, depending on where you are in the nation, they do have miscegenation laws. They do have laws about where you can and can't live.
Yes.
When I was teaching my classes, like I said, I'm an administrator now. When I was teaching my classes, I would routinely show my students a map that showed all the miscegenation and segregation laws in the South, but then I'd also show them laws in places like North Dakota, Washington State, Oregon,
Mm.
California, places like that. So when people say that that's a Southern problem, no, it's the law. It was the law in the South, but it was very much an American problem.
Oh,
Because as people well know, when you move to places like Detroit, you can't live where you want to in Detroit,
yeah.
right?
I've heard of those stories. Yeah, no
Yeah,
question.
you could
Yeah.
move where you wanted to in Detroit. And here's the other thing that we don't talk about. Black people migrate, let's say, from Alabama to Detroit. Guess what? White folks do too.
And
They
it's the same
migrated
white
too.
folks.
Yeah, they migrate from Alabama and they don't stop. They don't get rid of those cultural ways of thinking and knowing and being just because they're in Detroit, right?
Yeah. Okay, I got you. What is Jim Crow laws? Can you?
Jim Crow laws were laws that were passed throughout the South, increasingly after the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision that basically allowed state and local governments to determine how Blacks were going to live, where Blacks could eat, where Blacks could go to school, where they could get health care, even where they would be buried. So it
Wow.
segregated virtually every aspect of Black and white life throughout the South.
How is that on a black person's mindset living under those conditions? Okay, now slavery is ended. I guess when you slavery ended, you thinking, hey, I'm gonna have it a little easier.
No, no, because just because slavery ends doesn't mean that thinking about the anti-Black racism ends. That doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that people completely overhaul the way they have thought about Black people for hundreds of years. The laws have changed. Customs didn't change. Ways of thinking and being didn't change. So what essentially happened with Jim Crow laws is that they need to control Black people. And Jim Crow laws are the things that ensure that they can control Black people. And also, we're talking about in the deep rural South, they need agricultural laborers, and that is by and large Black people. So you create the laws to control and restrict what Black people can and can't do, where they can and can't go. There you have it. You have your labor force. But the story that I tell people is that just because you are oppressed doesn't mean that you are powerless. That's not what that means. What that means is you have to be very smart and very clever about how you find and access windows of opportunities and ways to agitate and chip away at the system. And that's what these Black people were doing in the rural South. So, case in point, a lot of people don't think about the fact that, for example, Marcus Garvey's UNIA has chapters in the rural South.
Okay.
They don't think about that, right? We
Right,
think
right, right,
about
right.
Marcus Garvey as largely being in New York and chapters of the Universal Negro Improvement Association as being in New York. No, they're in the Arkansas Delta.
I
They're in the
got you.
Arkansas Delta. So, in terms of Black activism and rural Black activism and civil rights activism, that's not limited to urban spaces. That has always happened in rural Black spaces. It had to. So, we're not talking about rural Black people, or we should stop thinking about them as passive individuals. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Growing up in the South and in those time frames, was a person able to excel in many ways? I know. I mean, the colleges started coming on. I mean, all the HBCUs and things of that sort. That
Mhm.
led into more of an educated Black population.
Right.
Um, was it easier in the South? Maybe do you think because the universities were there that Blacks were able to excel? Or
I think
yeah,
easy is a relative term. Yes, Black people have always excelled, right? Even if all didn't, some did. And I think that's important. Black people are disproportionately poor and oppressed and unable to access certain kinds of opportunities, but it doesn't follow that that was true for all Black people. So, yes, at the turn of the century, late 19th century, you have this proliferation of Black colleges and universities that allow more Black people to access college education. You also have somewhere close to 100 coeducational Black boarding schools that operate up until about 1960. And by the way, that's 6 years after the Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision. So I think this is an important point to really underscore how important education is to African Americans, that
sure.
they're creating these institutions, they're creating local schools, they're creating coeducational boarding schools, and all of this happened fairly soon after emancipation. So these people aren't, as they say in the country, letting any grass grow under their feet. They're about the business of institution building, because while they understand that while they may not be able to access some of these opportunities for themselves, perhaps their children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren can.
I guess as I come to a close, did white people in the South do institute some more policies, those who had, maybe religious convictions or something like that, to
Mhm.
help like make life better for Black people there that maybe
Absolutely.
wasn't so actively done in the North?
Absolutely. A lot of times, Black schools have financial support from white institutions, white local leaders in places like the Arkansas Delta. For example, they established a school down in Helena, Arkansas, that's way south of here, down in Phillips County, that allows African Americans to receive education just after the Civil War and emancipation. And those stories are important, right? Because it's not always an us versus them. There are more than a few examples of white people working with Black people to build institutions, to maintain institutions, even to gain political access. And so people don't know that. You know, sometimes you just don't know what you know. But there has always been interracial activism.
Yeah.
Now, that it's not as frequent as efforts to limit Black aspirations, but there's always been interracial activism. There have always been white people who were helping Black people improve their communities, institutions, so on and so forth.
To give you an example, here in the North, they built projects
Mhm.
as a housing opportunity for Black people.
Right.
Did they do things like that also in the South for Black people?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Of course, because one of the concerns, there's several concerns, constant concerns, by the way: health, food insecurity, and shelter,
Okay.
right? And so those things have always happened throughout the South. And again, usually in conjunction with Black leaders who
Okay.
understand who's in control of the school board, who sits on the city councils, who are the mayors and governors of these southern states. So this is bold because they're going to these people and saying, here's what we need for our communities. Now, is it always equal? Usually not. Um, do they have to do a sort of a certain amount of pandering to get these resources? Yes. But the bigger goal, the bigger objective is to get the resources necessary to sustain and uplift Black communities. And so,
Okay.
yes, that has always happened.
Two more. Is there something that I didn't ask you that you want to tell people? Something that you said, and then we'll let you plug the book.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was gonna plug the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, what I want to say to people is, if you're living in the northern or midwestern United States, and I lived in the Midwest for a while. I went to graduate school at Ohio State, so I spent 6 years in
Oh,
Columbus.
sure.
Trace your history. A lot of times people just focus on the fact that they're living in this northern midwestern space, but how did your family get there? And also explore, research their experiences since they've been there, because racism and segregation, as I said before, is not just limited to the South. This is a nationwide phenomena. So what kind of organizations were your people involved in? What kind of institutions did they build
Sure.
in their communities, in these spaces that help them thrive, that ensure that they were consistently viable? So there's some very rich history there that people are overlooking. And I think what you'll find is that there are strong connections between your family's lives in these urban spaces and the rural South.
All right, got you. You got a couple. You got a copy of your book there in front of you, nearby, or something like that.
Well, the book is not out yet. It'll be out in June 2021. But
Okay.
if you go to the University of Arkansas Press website, you can get
Okay.
it now for 40% off.
Okay. All right.
You
Well,
can get it
we'll
on sale before it even comes out.
yeah, there you go. We'll look for it. We're gonna stay in touch and blast out this that knowledge that you've written down on paper and pen and with the laptops and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Uh, hey, thank you,
Oh,
thank
you're
you, thank you, everybody. I'm telling you, you see what we do here on Strong Inspirations. I got people that know and they smart. They telling it. Oh my gosh,
and
I knew my
having
family
fun with
left,
it. And
huh?
having fun with it, by the way.
Yes.
I tell people I may be graduate school dean now, but my first love is researching the history of Black people. And
Yes.
when you start getting into that, it's if you have ever thought that Black people didn't do very much, start doing some Black history research.
Yes.
It will
Exactly, folk.
absolutely blow you away.
Exactly, folk.
Mhm.
I even got man, my book talks all about that. I list over 150 Black owned businesses,
Mhm.
and 15 of them were owned by slaves.
Right. And
Check.
lots of
Yep.
Black-owned businesses in the South too.
Yep.
Lots of Black-owned. Black people didn't just pick cotton. Black people own cotton gins.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Didn't
So
know that.
yes, they own cotton gins, and again, not all Black people in the rural South were sharecroppers. Some
Right,
of these people own land and had
right,
sharecroppers working for them.
right. Who worked for him?
Some of these Black people in the rural South owned land,
Yeah,
sharecroppers working for them.
yeah. Whoa, everybody. Did you know that?
Yep. Yep.
Everybody, thank you for watching Strong Inspirations today. Again, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the notification. I don't care what button you hit, just hit a button. Come on, hit a button. No matter what it is, because I'm going to come back at you. Thank you very much for being on here with us. You
Thank you for
have
having
a
me.
strong, safe, stay on your grind, stay beautiful. Just always thanks for doing what you do and sharing this with us. Everybody, we out. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.